أهلا بكل الذين ينضموا للاستماع إلى راديو بلدي أول راديو عربي أمريكي ويعنى بقضايا العرب في المهجر. برامجنا في راديو بلدي كل يوم جمعة من 8 وحتى 9 صباحا مع ليلى الحسيني في بث حي ومباشر عبر WNZK راديو 690 AM. صباح الخير بلدي، صباح الخير لكل مستمعينا.
Welcome to Radio Baladi, the first Arab, Middle Eastern and American simulcast radio show. Radio Baladi is broadcast every Friday morning on WNZK 690 AM from 8 until 9 Eastern Time on Good Morning Michigan with Layla Al-Husseini. Our call-in number 248-557-3300. And now, stay tuned for the best radio talk show on Arab and American issues with your host, Layla Al-Husseini.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNZK 690 AM and WZMZ 700 AM. Good morning, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, Associate Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland College Park and an expert on Arab and Muslim media. The international arena has recently been witnessing many tragic events related directly or indirectly to different mediated forms of artistic representation and expression, which are labeled by some as freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and seen by others as forms of bigotry, blasphemy, or hate speech. Can we talk about the concept of freedom of speech without addressing its potential limitations? How far are such limitations shaped and formed by different political, social, and religious considerations? Can we talk about a one-size-fits-all freedom of speech model? Should there be further legal regulations defining and implementing the dividing line between appropriate and inappropriate forms of speech? Or can we just rely on self-regulation in this regard? With me this morning discussing this important topic are two guests who are experts on this area, Dr. Adel Iskandar and Ms. Jean Kelleher. Dr. Adel Iskandar is an assistant professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. He is the author and co-author and editor of several works related to the Arab world and Arab media, including Egypt in Flux, essays on an unfinished revolution, Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism, and he has most recently been the co-editor of the volume Media Evolution on the Eve of the Arab Spring, published by Belgrave Macmillan. Prior to his arrival at Simon Fraser University, Dr. Iskandar taught for several years at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and the Communication, Culture, and Technology program at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He is co-editor of Jadaliyya. My second guest this morning is Ms. Jean Kelleher. She has been director of the City of Alexandria's Office of Human Rights since May 2000. Before that, she was a managing attorney at Legal Services of Northern Virginia, the region's legal aid program. Ms. Kelleher graduated from Connecticut College and did postgraduate work at Georgetown University and received her law degree from the Washington College of Law at American University. In 2007, she became a certified public manager through the George Washington University /COG Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments Institute for Excellence in Public Leadership. She is the past president of the Alexandria Bar Association and served on the board of directors of the Bar Foundation and has represented Alexandria on the Virginia State Bar Council and Executive Committee, and on the Virginia Continuing Legal Education Committee. She currently is the president of the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning. It's really a pleasure and honor to have both of you with me this morning in this show discussing this important topic. And I would like to start first by providing a definition of what you see as the concept or the notion of freedom of expression. If I start with you, Ms. Kelleher, if you tell us what you personally think or perceive as composing or defining this notion of freedom of expression.
Yes, good morning, Sahar. I'm delighted to be with you. I will be talking really from the perspective of those of us who serve as state and local directors of human rights agencies. And as an attorney, I've been a student of the law and the Constitution of the U.S. And to me, freedom of expression really is fundamentally a constitutionally protected right, freedom of speech. When you talk about whether we need more laws, more regulations, I personally think that the Constitution itself stands alone. That protection is the First Amendment. It's clear. What is not clear is what happens with court interpretation of that basic protection. And that's where we are now. There definitely are limits to freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And I think what we should talk about is when a person crosses the line, what should those consequences be?
Right, because, as we all know, the First Amendment to the Constitution does protect freedom of speech, as you rightly mentioned, but it also does have certain situations where this freedom of speech can also be curbed. Like you cannot, for example, shout fire in a crowded theater and get away with it because it really kind of damages or negatively affects public welfare. So there are certain limitations even under the First Amendment to the Constitution.
Absolutely. And in the work that I do and that other state and local directors do, we see day in and day out allegations of harassment. We also work in our communities with our local governments and our police departments on hate crimes, hate speech, that kind of thing. So we do see instances where one act or one word can be harassing and can create civil liability.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And if I move to you, Dr. Adel Iskandar, what is your definition also of the concept of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, in line with or in contrast to or maybe in elaboration of what Ms. Kelleher has already mentioned?
I think it would, if anything, it would probably be in concert with what's already been stated. I think what I would like to contribute, on the other hand, is a more experiential view of the interpretation of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, because to a large extent, individuals and collectives and communities have a different take on or interpretation of what it means to be expressing their views, what is deemed acceptable, appropriate, and possibly viable for one individual or for one community, or the threshold of what is acceptable may be very different for various communities. And so on one level, while the law applies equally and in equilibrium to all sort of individuals in society, there is what is considered problematic and what is considered jarring or offensive or problematic, or is a violation of one's personal perspectives and what constitutes decency, and which of course ends up manifesting in various ways. For instance, with freedom of the press attributions and interpretations of the law as they apply with regulatory systems such as the Federal Communications Commission. It does regulate expression in the media when it comes to what is deemed acceptable and what doesn't disrupt social order in some ways. But social order is also a social construct, and so these social constructs are very much experiential. So what I think is important to contemplate is how individuals and communities also understand and contemplate and think of the notion of being free to express themselves. It is a significant asset in the United States. I mean, the U.S. is known to be an environment that is much more quote-unquote liberal or progressive when it comes to context of freedom of expression, but we are also blinded by the sort of institutionalized red lines that we're not particularly familiar with, and each community and each collective and each individual in some instances has sort of an idiosyncratic way of thinking about what those red lines are. And so the one-size-fits-all approach to freedom of expression, it sounds good in the books and in some instances may be set by legal precedents, but is a very sort of is a very contested terrain when it comes to the experiences of communities and individuals.
Absolutely. This particular point about whether we can talk about a one-size-fits-all type of freedom of speech or freedom of expression or not is at the heart of this very conversation, because that's a view I share with you. It's a view I personally adopt. But sometimes when I talk about this particular concept on certain media or certain academic panels or conferences, sometimes I'm the black sheep on the panel. People think that there should be some kind of universal type of freedom of speech concept or notion that we can just apply unproblematically across the board. So Ms. Jean Kelleher, what do you think about this notion of whether we can or cannot have a one-size-fits-all type of freedom of speech?
I don't think we can ever have one-size-fits-all, no matter what the law is. I think it's important to start with the fundamental protection and to keep it fundamental. And then it really does take on this dynamic future, and it really depends on our experience, our culture, our education, and that's why it's so important, I think, to keep learning, to keep teaching, and to constantly update our knowledge, especially with the advent of technology and how quickly an expression can take hold and go viral, so to speak. It's just so important, I think, for us to train our children, teach our children what the law is, and then put it in an experiential and cultural context, knowing that there will be differences and that it's important for us to keep communicating about those differences. The court system is in place so that if someone does cross the line, there is a possible consequence. And that's why it's so important then for us to look at court cases over time and where those limitations are. You talked about that old case about crying fire in a crowded theater. Yeah. Obviously, that creates havoc and damage and personal loss. But in a very real sense, something like the very recent circumstance in Oklahoma with college students using words that alone create harm, and they're intended to denigrate a whole class of individuals, mm-hmm. that can be characterized as hate speech, and there are consequences. And so I really think it's important for us to acknowledge that one-size-fits-all doesn't provide the answer, because the founding fathers intended for the Constitution to be just that, and that hasn't borne out to be true.
Absolutely. I mean, there are also changing times, and there are new factors that come into the scene, including, as you properly mentioned, the emergence of new technologies and, social media, new media, which indeed is a topic that we're going to be touching upon in this conversation this morning, right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Jumana K-Ruz. You've seen her images on giant billboards across the metro. Jumana K-Ruz. You've seen her images on buses across the city. Now get to know Jumana K-Ruz.
Most people who sit in my office across from my desk are hurting on so many levels. One thing people do not know about medical malpractice is that the statute of limitation, meaning the time that you have to bring suit against a doctor, a hospital, is 2 years. In medical malpractice, that's a very, very short period of time. Not every lawyer is an advocate, but every lawyer should be an advocate.
Let Jumana K-Ruz protect your rights. Call the law offices of Jumana K-Ruz at 1-866-YOUR-RIGHTS, extension 100, or visit yourrights.com.
Life for Relief and Development is a non-profit charity that has been providing humanitarian aid and development to people and communities regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background for over 22 years. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life rushes to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Life also has development projects to provide medical relief, water purification, educational programs, relief for orphans, and much more. Your help and support can greatly improve these efforts. All donations are tax-deductible. For more information, please visit our website at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493. That's lifeusa.org, 248-424-7493.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNZK 690 AM and WZMZ 700 AM. Hello again and welcome to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and with me this morning are two distinguished guests, Dr. Adel Iskandar and Ms. Jean Kelleher, discussing the topic of freedom of speech and its limitations. And we were talking right before the commercial break about defining the notion of freedom of speech and also whether we can really talk about a one-size-fits-all type of freedom of speech. And I would like now to refer to some specific incidents that have dominated international media and headlines in major media outlets. Of course, most prominently, the Charlie Hebdo incident that took place in Paris and the uproar that happened afterwards, the reactions and counter-reactions to it. And I think it kind of exemplifies some of the unique challenges that we are facing today. There are so many challenges that are really emerging here. Lack of understanding of the other and the lack of cultural nuance and the freedom of speech that can sometimes cross the line. We were talking about crossing the line right before the break. Dr. Iskandar, what do you see at the heart of this particular issue of the reactions and counter-reactions to Charlie Hebdo, and what does that really tell us or teach us?
Wow, well, the Charlie Hebdo situation is much more complicated than most because of the way in which it became embroiled in a larger discussion surrounding not just freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of the press, but rather issues of public violence and what does it mean, and what are the rights associated with publics at large, and of course it becomes also embroiled in contemporary national identity because of course it became sort of a national tragedy, and so there are many layers to this particular incident that make it much more complicated. So on one level, I think one thing to take into consideration is even before we begin talking about freedom of expression and freedom of the press, we have to talk about what it means to be singled out or to be identified as sort of a member of a marginal community in a country like France in the contemporary moment, which I think feeds into this larger discussion. At least, of course, the lengthy history of French colonialism in North Africa and the rendering of North African migrants as sort of marginalized, subjugated publics inside France. Many of whom have all the major problems associated with contemporary economics in France are generally part and parcel of the North African Muslim experience and West African Muslim experience in France, where many of these communities live literally on the fringes of the cities in the banlieues, which are economically depressed, higher unemployment rates for youth among Muslims, and so a general inability to access the privileges associated with being French in the modern day sense, and so this becomes part of the way in which the experience of Frenchness, of course, which is idealized through the sort of larger than life utopian terms of the French Revolution, which are generally both anachronistic and out of sync with the modern experiences of Muslims inside France. And then it paints a much more complicated picture of what it means to be critiquing or representing the sort of the divine for Muslims living in this particular country. That it is much more complicated. It has a political dimension. It has a social dimension. Before we get into offending the other, if you will. So there's that dimension, and then there's of course the very much entrenched and holier than thou approach, almost dogmatic approach to freedom of the press and freedom of expression in France that sees a no holds barred approach to things. And so even though Charlie Hebdo is of course meant to be a satirical publication that pokes fun at all the things that would be deemed, holy or divine for all faiths in relatively equal measure, but it has at least over the past 5 to 10 years or so began a much more systematic sort of attack against Islam, much to the chagrin of the communities there, of whom many have reflected about this and challenged the agenda in a way so as to basically call for or demand some degree of consideration. And of course, Charlie Hebdo considers, or the editors, for a long time considered any critique to be an attempt to silence them, and it only emboldened them to continue presenting things in that light. So again, in the grand scheme of things, there are various layers to this. One of which is often forgotten is the sort of the geopolitical and economic circumstances that many Muslims in France find themselves, alongside their inability to access the privileges of being French, and perhaps more importantly, being able to access what it means to be French. And that I think is makes this a much more complicated national tragedy. And then so once the incident happens, of course a crime by all standards, and of course none of this discussion should in any way be perceived as anything less than a condemnation of that particular that particular action. But what it did was it recreated sort of an us versus them dynamic, again further entrenching not only the critique of Islam and the critique of Muslims and the practice of Islam as a faith for many of these already marginalized communities, whereby they had to perform they had to perform their Frenchness. They were demanded, they were asked to either be good Muslims or bad Muslims by effectively accepting whole cloth the notion of freedom of the press, against their own sort of instincts, which still continue to perceive both the Prophet Muhammad and their faith as divine or as holy or as needing sort of needing respect or needing a revelatory view, and that put them in a very, very complicated situation, and so it's a closed circle. There's no room to really maneuver to interpret either the law or its practice or its violation, for that matter. And I think that's part of the reason why the Charlie Hebdo incident is so incredibly polarizing and so incredibly difficult. And has left a real sort of jarring and perhaps even scarring mark, not only for the French public and the French Republic on one level because of the extent and the depth of the tragedy, but also perhaps doubly so for the Muslims in France who, on one level, condemn the attacks, but also don't want to see that condemnation being an endorsement of an interpretation of freedom of speech that further disenfranchises them and perceives them as inherently problematic or inherently associated with a faith that is often denigrated.
Absolutely. And I think that at the heart of this issue also is a very important point, which is, the dance of what we can call intercultural misunderstanding. It takes two to tango. And in this particular case, it is obvious that we have a dance of intercultural misunderstanding whereby one party is saying it's my freedom to say whatever I want and there are no limits to this freedom, and the other party is saying, no, you cannot cross the line and insult my own faith and what I hold dear and near to my heart. Even though I disagree with violence, I still think that when you adopt a slogan like Je suis Charlie, that adds, insult to the injury. Ms. Jean Kelleher, what do you think about this particular incident? And in addition to what Dr. Iskandar already mentioned and what I just said, if there's anything else that you would like to add to this conversation and to comment on it?
Just to concur that I think a common thread in incidents worldwide is that there are individuals and communities and societies that are being marginalized. They certainly feel aggrieved and subjugated. And the dynamic that you mentioned of us versus them really is the pervasive theme, I think, in any discussion that we have about freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Because the reality is we do have these tensions. We do have different political, social, religious views. And of course, that Charlie Hebdo situation is one of the most complicated and is a terrible tragedy. And it's very difficult in wrestling with something like that and even trying to bring those principles home to our local communities to try to craft a reasonable approach as we go forward to solving some of these difficult issues. So I concur with the comment that this is incredibly complicated. And then I go back to focus on our local communities where it's incumbent on us to maintain communication and teaching and learning.
I think you mentioned a very important point about education and socialization. You said something earlier in the conversation, Ms. Kelleher, about how we raise our children. Again, if we talk about things like appropriate versus inappropriate speech, or hate speech, or insulting other people's faith and values, all of these things I think need to be addressed in the school curriculum as well as in our own socialization of our own children at home. Would you like to maybe add something on why this is important? How can we do it in a better way?
Well, I think it absolutely is crucial, and I think that when instances hit the news, we realize that there has been a deficiency somewhere in the upbringing of the individuals who are saying certain things, and I'm referring now to some of the instances in the U.S. But again, there is no one-size-fits-all. We can develop a curriculum, we can try to teach our children, but there still is no one-size-fits-all curriculum because of these different cultural experiences and our different views. But it is so important for us to address those. I think that when something hits the news, I think, all right, what else is there that we don't know, that we don't see? Because for every one incident that hits the news, there are probably so many more that are occurring more quietly and that are not coming to the forefront. What's, I think, tough for all of us to wrestle with is when we talk about crossing the line, we're crossing from a civil legal situation to a criminal situation often when something happens and these tragedies happen. And that's much more difficult to wrestle with and coming up with a solution because that tends to polarize people and it really entrenches the beliefs even more.
Absolutely, and I think this idea of where do you draw the line is a very important point that we need to address and talk about a little bit more right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Dana, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
Are you going to start up a restaurant or a grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Najee Abood at 248-442-9292. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Najee Abood now, 248-442-9292. New Concept Products and Designs, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. For more information, visit newconceptproducts.com, 248-442-9292. It's never too early to get your child on the right track. From their first words to first grade, Dreamy Children's Center in Troy works closely with parents to provide an experience that goes beyond early education. The highly qualified and experienced staff use a variety of programs that can help nurture important personality traits like responsibility, independence, problem solving, motivation, and respect. They also have educational programs ranging from preschooling for infants, toddlers, transitional toddlers, and pre-K to Montessori-approved programs and bilingual curriculums for young children. They're open from 6 a.m. to 6:30 p.m., can provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner with snacks in between, and can also arrange for after-school pickup. Dreamy Children's Center in Troy is located at 37373 DeQuinder, just above 16 Mile Road, and can be found on Facebook at Dreamy Children's Center. Ask about the free preschool program. Call today, 248-680-9170, 248-680-9170.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arab, WNZK 690 AM and WZMZ 700 AM. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. We are discussing today the topic of freedom of expression and freedom of speech and its limitations. And with me this morning are two distinguished guests, Dr. Adel Iskandar and Ms. Jean Kelleher, discussing this topic. Right before the commercial break, we were talking about where to draw the line, which I think is a very important point. Some of my students asked, for example, how can you criticize some actions of the Saudi government without being considered Islamophobic? Or how can you criticize some policy of the Israeli government without being considered anti-Semitic? What are some of the red flags that will tell you that you have crossed the line into the arena of hate speech or the arena of bigotry and blasphemy? These are very, very important and sensitive issues that I get asked all the time. And I would like to, kind of get your insights, both of you, on this issue. I'll start with you, Ms. Kelleher. What do you think are some of the red flags or the alarming lines that we should really see and detect here in, really kind of drawing the line between what is considered appropriate and what is considered inappropriate forms of freedom of speech and freedom of expression?
In the United States, those of us who do work enforcing federal, state, and local anti-discrimination laws have case law that we rely on, so that when someone comes to one of our offices and makes a complaint about discrimination, sometimes there are allegations of hate or hate speech or harassment. And in investigating particular allegations, we have a framework of the law that we can apply. Sometimes a person will perceive treatment that perhaps does not rise to the level, and the words under the law are severe and pervasive, that the actions of the person against whom the complaint is made do not rise to the level of being severe and pervasive enough to provide a remedy under law. That doesn't mean that something didn't happen, perhaps in the workplace. So what we try to do is acknowledge what has happened. If there's a legal remedy, help facilitate obtaining that. But short of that, try to bring the parties together to come up with some kind of a resolution, if at all possible. We use alternative dispute resolution much more now than we ever did before in the court framework. So my perspective really is at the state and local level in the United States, where we have guidance about where the line is crossed. And in our work with communities, and so much that's been happening in the United States right now, we're also working on community relations in our cities and counties across the U.S. to try to establish bridges of communication and understanding so that we know what is acceptable behavior. But that gets complicated. It especially is complicated, as we have seen in relationships sometimes between police and individuals who are in certain communities. So there is so much work to be done. We talked earlier about teaching children. Well, while some are teaching children tolerance and understanding, others are teaching their children to hate, quite frankly. So it is complicated.
And Dr. Adel Iskandar, if I was to also talk about the very same point about where do we draw the line between what is considered appropriate and inappropriate forms of speech, and what are some of the red flags or alarming really signals that can tell you have crossed the line into the terrain of unacceptable speech that kind of infringes on other people's freedom or creates some degree of damage. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, this is, I think, the crux of the problem, because to a large extent, the way in which laws are articulated pertaining to freedom of speech or freedom of expression or rights discourse in general. I mean, even if you look at, let's say, the United Nations Declaration for Human Rights, which is a very universalizing document applicable, for all 194 member states of the United Nations, are all signatories to the document. Once you get into the application, it becomes much more complicated. And so, in the grand scheme of things, I see how the law needs to have room and to be somewhat relativist, but at the same time, it is precisely this relativism that renders the law in many instances much more problematic and can further entrench the privileges of one community at the expense of another. So it is very, very tricky. I think when we put this within the context of actual exemplars, for instance, you mentioned two particular contexts, that of the critique of Saudi Arabia as being Islamophobic, and that of the critique of Israel. I think to a large extent the critique of states can be perceived as a critique of domestic and foreign policy, which is not the same as the critique of a group of individuals on the grounds of their faith or their interpretation of the faith. But we also have come to see circumstances, and this is to add another level of complication to this. It's not as if it wasn't complicated enough, but if we add another level of complication, we start to see how communities belonging to specific sort of worldviews or specific, religious affiliation have themselves began to adopt a position that is much more in favor of self-critique than anything else. So it's not as if a substantial proportion of the Jewish community necessarily supports the government of Israel and its actions, or even in the case of Charlie Hebdo, a much more controversial, much more complicated issue, a not so small proportion of Muslims living in France had actually come out and marched in the protests against the act, and also utilized the hashtag Je suis Hebdo and things of that sort. So the fault lines are extremely gray and very complicated. What it basically means is that the laws cannot become a cookie cutter. But at the same time, the laws have to be in place and have to be foundational enough that they preserve the rights for those who are effectively downtrodden. I think in the grand scheme of things, the important thing to recognize here is who possesses power and who is disempowered by those dynamics. So, for instance, when we talk about freedom of speech in relation to issues pertaining to race, for instance, it's important to recognize that we are living in societies that privilege or allow for a very significant standard and differential for experience, and it's afforded to some racial groups, some communities at the expense of others. In the same way that when we look at the Middle East or the Muslim world or any part of the world in general, there are privileges afforded to both majorities and various other sort of distinctions between collectives. So I think that I typically like to think of these red lines as being determined by the extent to which they create a circumstance or create a climate that renders those who are most disadvantaged within the status quo and give them room to express themselves, as opposed to silencing them beyond their already sort of disenfranchised situation. So I would apply the same thing to discussions of, let's say, freedom of expression, freedom of the press in the Middle East, which is really, you know this more than anyone else, Dr. Sahar, as a notable scholar of the press and expression in the Middle East. It's in dire circumstances, and so when we look at it from a transnational perspective, we begin to see that this is a transnational problem. And not just one that can be seen or perceived through the lens of let's say Western society alone.
Absolutely. We do have a caller with us this morning, Mr. Ted. Welcome to the show. We have a caller with us this morning?
Yes, Doctor. We're very sorry. I think it's he was waiting.
Okay.
He hung up, so he was waiting for. I'm so sorry.
Anymore?
Yeah. He hung up. He was waiting for a long time. I'm so sorry. Okay.
Right. Okay. No problem. Thank you. So again, these lines of, for example, critiquing a certain government versus unacceptable critique for people has to be really kind of clarified. And I think there is room here to integrate it in our really educational curriculum. Again, explain to our students, explain to our children at home what constitutes and what does not constitute free speech. But we are also facing another challenge now, which is the advent of new forms of communication, new forms of technology. The use of social media and new media complicates things, because you do have now citizen journalists, you have people who are writing their own views and opinions and reaching millions of people online. And that in itself brings in new challenges as well as new opportunities. Ms. Kelleher, would you like to comment on this new technological revolution and what kind of challenges as well as opportunities is brought? We have 1 minute before the commercial break, and we can come back to it later. Please go ahead.
Yes. Just briefly, I think the new technology has created an opportunity for individuals to say things that they would not say if they were face-to-face with individuals. And so I think we're in a period of transition and growing pains with respect to that kind of media. But I was thinking with our conversation that the media portrayal of some of the incidents needs to have our attention as well. So, for instance, if we're talking about an incident in the United States involving racial tensions, the media sometimes will characterize those who are supporting one side as supporters and those who are supporting the other side as demonstrators in kind of a negative context. So I think we need to be aware of media portrayals of the very incidents that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we'll come back again to discuss this issue of the technological revolution and the use of social media and new media and its impact on the notion of free speech right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
قشات ميديترينيان ماركت بإدارة سهر قشات وأولاده يرحبون بالجالية العربية والكلدانية. جميع أنواع المواد الغذائية، البان طازجة، الكرزات والبهارات الطازجة. داخل الأسواق مطعم ميديترينيان شيش كباب يقدم يوميا جميع أنواع الكباب، المقبلات العربية العراقية وصواني الكامبو المميزة. تفتح الأسواق من 8 إلى 9 مساء من الاثنين وحتى السبت، ومن 8 صباحا إلى 9 مساء يوم الأحد. تقع الأسواق على 32839 نورث ويسترن هايوي في مدينة فارمينغتون هيلز. لحوم حلال للجالية الإسلامية. لطلباتكم من المطعم كول 248-538-7855. That is 248-538-7855. قشة ميديترينيان ماركت، خدمة متميزة ومعاملة راقية. باتسيز للعرائس، أجمل مجموعة أزياء ومن أرقى دور الأزياء الأمريكية، إضافة إلى أكبر تشكيلة لفساتين لحفلات المناسبات ملكات الجمال ومن أشهر المصممين
David Tuter, David Bow, and McDougall Coucher.
أسعار مناسبة، خدمة متميزة، تصليح الملابس بمهارة فائقة. مصممة الأزياء باتسي بشير، خبرة أكثر من 34 عاما في عالم تصميم الأزياء. للمواعيد اتصلوا على 313-908-1393. يقع المحل على 5050 Greenfield between Ford Road and Michigan Avenue. Call 313-908-1393. باتسي بشير، علامة مميزة في عالم الأزياء.
This is Dr Sahar Khamis. Join me on the third Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be discussing some of the most important current political, economic, and social issues in my program, The Bridge. On Radio Baladi, on America's Voice of the Arabs, WNZK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM. Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. We are discussing today freedom of expression and its limitations. And with me this morning are Dr. Adel, Iskandar, and Ms. Jean Kelleher discussing this important topic. Right before the commercial break, we were talking about the new technological revolution and the use of social media and new media, and what kind of challenges and opportunities are brought about by these new forms of media in terms of allowing new forms of expression, but also sometimes posing threats to forms of expression that can really be detrimental or damaging to other people as well. Ms. Kelleher, would you like to add anything to what you have already been talking about right before the break in this regard?
Well, I think the opportunity is for sharing information, and certainly it brings the world to our doorstep, having technology. But as I had mentioned before, there also are damaging communications that tend to go viral and tend to polarize individuals.
Absolutely. And Dr. Adel Iskandar, as an expert on Arab media, you have written a lot about the media in the Arab world from a cultural perspective, from a communication perspective. What do you see are some of the opportunities and challenges, rather briefly, because we still have a number of other issues we would like to discuss, but basically the positives and negatives, the opportunities and challenges that are brought about by this new technological revolution?
Well, I mean, I think, as Jean said, the advantages are ones that we all recognize, and they're largely self-evident. But the problem really lies in the fact that with the use of the social media, it's really tapping into that gray area between what is public and what is private. I mean, what we're sharing on Twitter, on Facebook, or elsewhere is an expression of the self, and we feel pressure to say something or to comment about issues pertaining to day-to-day life or current events, for that matter. And so sometimes it allows for there to be like echo chambers where people say things that they think are reverberating among a community of like-minded individuals, but really it is immensely public. Or in other circumstances where there is a little bit of a herd mentality that develops online, but it's refracted against a larger sort of much more complicated public perspective on things. So there are many incidents where we see that what is being said online is deeply hurtful, deeply problematic, and in more instances than not, partly because the law is still very sort of loose on this, and I think in no small measure, I think that's advantageous that we're not curbing social media expression, but nevertheless it allows it to be almost like the wild, wild west, where things that are said online are incredibly damaging and very problematic, and in some cases very insightful. So it's not strange for us to go onto discussion forums or to follow Twitter hashtags about any discussion that very quickly degenerate into racism, bigotry, sexism, misogyny. The examples are plentiful. So it really is a red. I'm focusing on the negative, I have to say, but it is a major red flag about how we're going to begin to manage public discourse. Whereas freedom of expression and the laws that exist are meant to sort of liberally interpret freedom of expression. What happens when freedom of expression, unhindered, unfettered, unadulterated in this way in the social media, has serious repercussions because individuals are saying things that are deeply traumatic or highly problematic, or can have significant repercussions beyond that. And so I don't think this is resolved just yet, but it raises a question about what is in people's psyche and how it ends up going public and what we can do about it. I mean, some of the worst things that I've seen, for instance, as of late, particularly in relation to, let's say, the Charlie Hebdo incident. Mm-hmm. Some of the worst stuff was actually expressed on social media, going far beyond what was actually published in Charlie Hebdo as a magazine, or even in sort of the reaction to Charlie Hebdo from some of the more sort of hardline reactionary communities. So it's deeply worrying in the grand scheme of things. If this is the other side of public expression, then we're privy to or being sort of presented with a much more ominous problem that we are going to have to deal with along the way.
Absolutely. In my first co-authored book, Islam.com, all of these issues emerged very clearly. It was also very obvious that the curtain of anonymity, when people's names and identity are not known, that provides them with some kind of immunity, if you will, to unfortunately spread hate speech online or to attack others across the board. And these kinds of attacks and hate speech can also go viral very quickly on social media. So obviously there's a need for better forms of regulation, if you will, of this very open space of communication that can bring its own opportunities, but certainly poses its own challenges as well. And Ms. Kelleher, if I move with you to the topic of legal regulation of speech, how far do you support the idea that there should be new laws and regulations imposed in order to set the boundaries, if you will, of, crossing the line, as we were talking about it earlier, into the arena of unacceptable or inappropriate speech like blasphemy or bigotry or hate speech?
I think it will be a long time before the law will catch up to some of the expressions that we're talking about in the context of technology, because even over and above the anonymous expressions that we're talking about, there are very specific attacks. There is cyberbullying that is occurring where individuals and groups are attacking other individuals and groups and actually leading to consequences that could be construed as criminal, forcing someone, in effect, to take his or her own life because of the severity of the attacks. And I think it will be a long time before the law is able to even address that kind of potential criminal behavior.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Iskandar, do you like to also comment on this particular point very briefly, because we have very few minutes left in the show and there are still at least one more question I'd like to ask. So again, this idea of should we impose more legal regulations, and how could this be different, let's say in the West versus, for example, in the Arab world, being an expert on Arab media?
So, as you very well know, while on one level, I think it's necessary for there to be, or at least to have interpretations of the current law, not even necessarily, redrafting new laws or something along those lines. And I'm not a legal expert by any stretch of the imagination, so I can't even conceive of what this sort of legal environment might look like. But in the grand scheme of things, when one looks at a much more sort of restricted authoritarian media landscape and an environment where freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and freedom of speech are very significantly hindered, it pushes one to in the direction of wanting to see a much more open environment. And so I'm weary of what these regulations might look like once they manifest, and the extent to which they may be used or abused to further silence communities that would otherwise seek refuge in these modalities. So, for instance, would it be possible for there to be, broadcast entities and publications and various other sort of platforms of public expression for communities that find themselves on the fringes, essentially, or is it easy for them to be perceived as sort of disrupting the status quo simply because they don't fall under a particular criterion within a new founded broadcast terrain? So I'm very weary of imposing or increasing the levels of restriction that exist, largely because I think even though the system as it stands has significant sort of crevices within it, and a lot is falling through the cracks, I think the direction should be more towards entrenching an educated public, having better media literacy, ensuring that there is tolerance on a societal level, more so than anywhere else, and that if in those circumstances we might have a much more advantageous outcome than basically just legislating or producing laws that shackle freedom of expression. So I think there's a middle ground there that doesn't necessarily involve further legalization.
Absolutely.
I would agree with that, Sahar. I absolutely agree that having an open discourse is absolutely crucial to solving some of these challenges. And I would go back to you were mentioning the UN Declaration for Human Rights and treaties and conventions that I think provide a broad framework and an aspirational goal, I think, for local communities as well as international communities. I think we need to bring some of these international principles of human rights home to the local and state level here in the United States, for instance.
Absolutely.
And better literacy, absolutely, more education. And then I think that the court interpretation of the existing laws would have an opportunity, I think, to present the limitations in a way that individuals can understand them.
Absolutely. At the end of this conversation, I can only thank our guests this morning, Dr. Adel Iskandar and Ms. Jean Kelleher, for being with us this morning. Thank you both very much for this excellent and enlightening conversation. And thanks to our listeners this morning. This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Thank you all very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.